He said the GPS showed a shortcut that we'd cut through the countryside and get there faster. But after about 20 minutes on that dirt road, everything started to look the same. Our phone signals were gone, and all we could see were trees. The gas tank was running low, and it was already dark. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it something was off. When we finally saw the glow of a house in the distance, it was almost a relief. An old farmhouse standing alone in the middle of nowhere. At least someone lived there, or so we thought. The house looked old but well kept. The porch light was on, and a rocking chair swayed gently with the breeze. Dakota was the first to step out of the car and onto the porch, knocking hard on the door. Nothing. He knocked again, calling out, "Silence." That's when we noticed the door was slightly open, not broken or forced, just left ajar. Elin suggested we leave, but no one wanted to go back down that dark road without knowing where we were. Curiosity won. We pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell of food hit us first, and what we saw made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We stood frozen in the doorway, taking in the bizarre scene before us. The dining table was set perfectly, like something out of an old family dinner plates. Silverware, glasses filled with what looked like iced tea. But the most unsettling part was the food. Each plate had a full meal on it: roast meat, mashed potatoes, green beans. It should have smelled warm, inviting, but it didn't. The food was ice cold. Not just room temperature, but unnaturally cold, as if it had been sitting there for days, yet without a single sign of decay. No flies, no mold, nothing. Elin hovered near the door, shifting nervously, ready to bolt. But Keel, always the skeptic, walked deeper into the room, running a hand over one of the chairs as if testing for dust. "Someone lives here," he muttered. "Maybe they just stepped out," but that didn't make sense. The house was silent. No hum of a fridge, no creaking floors upstairs. Just an eerie stillness. Then, as if to break that silence, a faint sound drifted from above us. Slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy, dragging. For a second, no one moved. We just stood there, listening. The footsteps were slow, almost rhythmic, like someone pacing just above us. Dakota's hand clenched into a fist, his jaw tightening. "We need to go," he whispered, but no one made a move. It was like we were all waiting for something to happen, some confirmation that what we were hearing was real. Then the sound stopped. Dead silence. My pulse pounded in my ears. I was about to take a step back toward the door when a floorboard upstairs groaned. Loud and sharp, like someone had shifted their weight, that was it. Elin turned and bolted for the door, and the rest of us snapped out of whatever trance we'd been in. We scrambled outside, practically shoving each other down the steps. "Go!" Keel twisted the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. He cursed, turning the key again. Nothing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely process what was happening. Then, without warning, every light in the house went out at once. The porch, the dining room, whatever glow had been inside gone. The house became a black void against the night. Panic set in, the kind that makes your chest tighten like a vice. Keel kept twisting the key, his knuckles white, but the engine refused to turn over. Come on," he muttered under his breath. My eyes were locked on the house, my brain screaming that we were being watched. The darkness inside felt heavy, pressing against the windows like something unseen was right there, staring back. Then, movement, just a flicker, like a shadow shifting in the upstairs window. My breath caught. Did you see that? I choked out. But before anyone could answer, something slammed against the back of the car. The whole vehicle jolted forward like something massive had hit it. Elin let out a strangled yell, spinning around to look out the back window. What the hell was that? I twisted in my seat, but there was nothing there. Just an empty yard and the looming blackness of the house. Try again, Dakota shouted, his voice cracking. Keel turned the key one more time. The engine roared to life. Relief flooded through me until we saw it. The front door of the house was now wide open. We hadn't heard it move. No creak, no slam. Just open like an invitation or a warning. Keel slammed his foot on the gas, and the tires kicked up dirt as we peeled out of there. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. None of us spoke. We were too afraid to look back. But I couldn't help it. As we sped down the dirt road, I turned my head toward the house one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure stood just inside the open doorway, completely still, barely visible in the darkness. No features, no details, just a tall, shadowy shape. And then, as if it knew I was looking, it took a single step forward. I snapped my head back, squeezing my eyes shut. Drive faster, I choked out. Keel didn't need to be told twice. The car bounced and swerved over the rough road, every bump making my stomach lurch. The headlights barely cut through the thick night, but we didn't care. We just needed to get as far away from that house as possible. After what felt like an eternity, we saw the glow of a paved road up ahead. The moment the tires hit asphalt, the tension in the car finally broke. What the hell was that place? No one had an answer. And honestly, I don't think I ever want to know. As we sped down the main road, no one said a word. The only sound was the heavy breathing of 4 people trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were still trembling, gripping my knees so hard they ached. I kept expecting to see headlights in the rearview mirror, or worse, something running after us in the darkness. But the road behind us stayed empty. I told myself we were safe, that whatever was in that house wasn't following us. But the fear wouldn't leave. It clung to me like a second skin. After about 20 minutes of driving, the first road sign appeared, confirming we were back on the right path. Keel finally eased off the gas, his fingers still wrapped tight around the wheel. We tell no one about this, he muttered, his voice hoarse. No one argued. Who would believe us? That we found a house deep in the woods with a perfectly set dinner table, freezing cold food, and someone watching us from the shadows. I glanced at my phone. Still no signal. When I looked back up, I saw Elin staring out the window, his face pale. It's still out there, he whispered. And the worst part? I knew he was right. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably no more than 30 minutes before we finally saw lights in the distance. A gas station. A small, rundown place, but at that moment, it felt like salvation. Keel pulled into the lot and killed the engine. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as what we had just escaped. No one moved at first. We just sat there, the car ticking as it cooled, the reality of what had happened settling in like a weight on our chests. Then, without a word, Dakota opened his door and stepped out. One by one, we followed. Inside, the place smelled like old coffee and motor oil. A bored-looking cashier barely glanced at us as we shuffled in. I made my way to the back, grabbing a bottle of water, but my hands were still shaking. When I got to the counter, I noticed Elon staring at the wall behind the register, his face pale. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. There, pinned to a faded bulletin board, was an old, yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline sent a chill down my spine. "Family vanishes from remote farmhouse dinner left untouched." The photo beneath it was unmistakable. It was the house. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the edge of the counter to steady myself, my fingers digging into the old wood. Dakota, noticing my reaction, turned to look at the article. His eyes widened, and he reached up to take it off the board, but the cashier's voice stopped him. "You don't want to mess with that." We all turned to look at the guy behind the counter. He was older than I'd first thought, with deep lines on his face and tired eyes that flicked between us. There was something in his expression, something that told me he already knew why we were reacting this way. My mouth was dry when I finally spoke. "This place, this house, what happened to them?" The cashier sighed, leaning on the counter like he'd told this story too many times before. "That old farm's been empty for decades. Family that lived there just disappeared one night. Table was set, food on the plates, still warm when the neighbors found it the next day. No sign of struggle, no bodies, nothing. Just gone." He shook his head. "People say the house ain't empty, though. Say sometimes at night you can still see the lights on." A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I glanced at Elon, his face drained of color. "The lights," he whispered. "We saw them." None of us wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. The house hadn't been abandoned. At least, not in the way people thought. The cashier studied us for a moment, then sighed like he had seen this before. "You kids were out there tonight, weren't you?" His voice was quieter now, almost cautious. We didn't answer, but our silence was enough. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath. "You're lucky you got out. Most people don't." A heavy weight settled in my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward on the counter, lowering his voice. "Some who go up there never come back. Cops find their cars, sometimes their shoes, but no sign of them." His gaze darkened. "And the ones who do come back, they ain't the same. They see things, hear things. Some of 'em don't last long afterward." I swallowed hard. My hands were shaking again. "Last long?" The cashier exhaled through his nose like he was debating whether to say more. Finally, he said, "A man came in here, 15 years ago. Just like you, shaken pale. He and his buddies had been up there. They swore they saw something. A few weeks later, one of them went missing, then another. Suicide, accidents, just gone. Only one was left." Dakota took a step back from the counter. "And what happened to him?" The cashier's eyes locked onto his. "He stopped sleeping. Said he could hear footsteps outside his window at night. Then, One morning, he wasn't there anymore. Door to his place was wide open, his breakfast still on the table. A heavy silence settled between us. The weight of the cashier's words pressed down like a stone on my chest. I wanted to call bullshit, to say it was just some local legend meant to scare outsiders, but I couldn't. Not after what we had seen. Not after the footsteps, the lights, the way the house seemed to breathe in the dark. Elin was the first to break. "We need to go." His voice was tight, his hands curled into fists. He turned on his heel and walked straight out of the gas station without waiting for us. Keel followed, looking over his shoulder at the cashier one last time. I stayed frozen for a second longer, my eyes locked on that yellowed newspaper clipping. The man behind the counter spoke again, softer this time. "Don't go back. Whatever you do, don't go back." I didn't say anything. I just nodded and walked out. Outside, Elin was already in the car, gripping the dashboard like he was afraid to let go. "We shouldn't have gone there," he muttered. "We shouldn't have gone there." His leg bounced anxiously, his eyes darting toward the road as if he expected something to be standing there, watching. Dakota slid into the passenger seat and exhaled shakily. "We're never talking about this again." No one disagreed. As we pulled out of the gas station, I forced myself to look forward, to focus on the road ahead. But just before we turned onto the highway, something in the side mirror caught my eye. A figure, tall, unmoving, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. I slammed my eyes shut and turned away. When I opened them again, there was nothing there, but I knew deep in my bones that it was still out there, and it always would be